All right, let us get started. Good afternoon. I'm Patricia Wilson. Today, we continue our series on the book, The Gift of Black Folk, The Negroes in the Making of America by W.E.B. Du Bois, in which Dr. Du Bois examines the profound influence of Black Americans on the shaping of the nation, chronicling the contributions of African Americans from the 1600s to the early 20th century. Welcome. Today, we will focus on Chapter 4, The Emancipation of Democracy. In this chapter, Dr. Du Bois reviews the contributions of Blacks to democracy in America, including the rise and growth among the enslaved to be a free and active part of democracy, which forced American democracy to grapple with the fact that, as long as there were slaves, indeed, as long as there were people who could not freely participate in all aspects of American life, America could not be a free society. The chapter also looks at the impact of the 1791 Haitian Revolution, not just on North America, but South America as well, and how that revolution sparked rebellions and insurrections that, to be sure, were often unsuccessful, but nonetheless significantly affected the United States, including impacting the occurrence of the Louisiana Purchase. The book looks at, or at least this chapter looks at the different ways African Americans appeal to reason, challenging their obligation to pay taxes while enjoying only limited rights to, for example, vote, taxation without representation. Dr. DuBois talks about what he believes may be the crowning gift of America and to the world, that is deliberate bargaining, appealing to the self-interest of whites in critical times as a means to advance the causes that were important to blacks. As I read this chapter, The Emancipation of Democracy, my first question was, as an attorney, what did Dr. Du Bois mean by democracy? According to my limited research, Du Bois's understanding of democracy, at least as a young man, was as a model form of government based on the open exchange of ideas and consent by the governed. He approached democracy as an ethos, a way of life, an ongoing process of discovery, learning, and self-realization. Keys to democracy, according to Dr. Du Bois, were equality, education, economic justice, political participation, social justice, and cultural recognition. Overall, Dr. Du Bois crafts a compelling case of the many ways Blacks contributed to democracy in America, albeit a democracy that he would acknowledge was quite imperfect in many ways. Allow me to introduce our distinguished panel who will share their thoughts about Dr. Du Bois in this particular chapter. My brief introductions will not do full justice to the extensive records each of our panelists have amassed, so I encourage you to look at their online bios to learn more about them. I begin with Dr. Corey Little Edwards. She is a professor and a university distinguished scholar in the College of Arts and Sciences at The Ohio State University. She earned her bachelor's degree in civil engineer from the Illinois Institute of Technology, but sociology seems to have been her calling. She earned both a master's degree and PhD in sociology from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her areas of expertise include gender, race, and class, and her current research examines the cultural practices, social dynamics, and organizational structures within churches, particularly African American churches and interracial churches. She is an active scholar, having published dozens of articles and book chapters and engaged in numerous peer-reviewed presentations and other presentations as an invited guest, including one in which the topic was, "What would be different? How a Du Boisian vision would have improved the sociology of religion." Our next panelist is Dr. Thomas Hibbs, who is currently the J. Newton Razor Senior Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University, where he is also Dean Emeritus, having served for 16 years as the inaugural Dean of the Honors College. Dr. Hibbs has also served as Department Chair of Philosophy at Boston College and as President of the University of Dallas. He has published 8 books, the most recent of which is The Theology of Creation, Ecology, Art, and Laudato Si. His recent scholarly essays include Aquinas and Black Natural Law, and a co-authored essay comparing Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. on courage in response to oppression. Dr. Hibbs has published widely in the popular press, including the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Wall Street Journal, and the Dallas Morning News. Dr. Hibbs has taught W.E.B. Du Bois in interdisciplinary courses at Boston College and in the philosophy department at Baylor. Our third panelist is Dr. Earl Wright II. He is the Neville Frierson Bryan Chair of Sociology and Chairperson of the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Rhodes College in Memphis, which also happens to be his hometown. Dr. Wright earned his PhD from the University of Nebraska and spent time on the faculty of a number of other universities before returning to Memphis. Dr. Wright's primary research and teaching interests are on the contributions of Blacks to American sociology and the sociology of hip hop. He is an award-winning scholar with a passion for the American South, and he is one of the leading scholars on W.E.B. DuBois and Black sociology, having published or edited a number of books on Dr. DuBois, including the book, The First American School of Sociology, which examines the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, which was led by W.E.B. DuBois. I'll start by asking each of the panelists to spend about 8 minutes or so sharing what they particularly want you to take away from this webinar. Dr. Little, or Dr. Edwards, excuse me, you are up first.
Well, thank you so much, Patricia, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really grateful to be here. I am going to share some slides, everyone, and so if you can just give me a moment to set that up, and then we will get going here. Well, so as you can see from my first slide there, um, and I hope you're seeing the actual main slide. Is that right, everybody?
I think we may be seeing the presenter view.
Okay, well, guess what? I can change that. There we go. How about that?
There we go.
All right, I'm glad I asked before we got too far along. So, as you can see in my title there, I am interested really in the religion and emancipation of democracy. And that is in many ways because that really is central to my scholarship. I look at the intersection of race and religion and inequality in America. And I think what you will see, and I hope to demonstrate a bit today, is that indeed Du Bois takes this seriously as well and does so in this chapter that we have been charged to consider. I also just want to highlight before I begin just my respect for the brilliance and how prolific W.E.B. Du Bois was and the contributions that he has made to our scholarly community and our way of thinking. And I'm very grateful for my colleagues at Baylor for putting on such a webinar series and again, having the opportunity to participate. So I want to really highlight here something that perhaps didn't come out to you right off the bat, but again, for someone like myself who really pays attention to religion, is that you should see that religion is integral to America's framing of freedom as Du Bois outlines in this chapter. And now we might hear in the Declaration of Independence, and we might not hear this immediately, but this is what it says. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And I highlight creator there to make a key point, right? That right from the beginning, when the United States was thinking about separating from Britain, it was calling on a divine calling of their why they needed to be free. But also, what Du Bois highlights is again, we see even the Quakers in 1688, before the Declaration of Independence, also calling on a religious kind of framing for understanding how we are to think about freedom. And they say this, in particular in relating to slavery in the US. Now, though they are Black, we cannot conceive there is more liberty to have them slaves than it is to have other white ones. There is a saying, and people who are familiar with biblical scripture this probably resonates with you, that we shall do to all men like as we will be done to ourselves. Make no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are. Here is liberty of conscience, which is right and reasonable. And so this intersection is critical, as I said, to the framing of freedom, and Du Bois highlights this throughout. Now, what I want to also note here is that it's not just about in the discussion of freedom where religion is important, that religion actually is structured throughout American society. But for us to be able to understand that, it is important for us to understand how is religion structured in American society. Now, what we have is something in the First Amendment which says this: Congress cannot establish religion nor prevent the free exercise or expression of religion. This has been a very important formal norm or law in our society because it really had implications for how religion was done. Religion could not be taken for granted, right? Religion wasn't something that the government pushed down on people or required. It meant that it had to come from the ground, so to speak. And so, what we colloquially call the separation of church and state, what's here in the First Amendment, was what we also refer to as the disestablishment of religion. That is to say, there is no religion that is established by the government. But what that meant practically is that we had a proliferation of different types of religions. I mean, many of you have to know all of these different denominations we have just in Christianity. There are actually over 200 in the United States, over 200 denominations. But what that has also meant is that we have had a kind of religious marketplace. And what that means is that because the government does not support or establish a religion, it also means that if you're going to have a religion, you're going to have a church, if you're going to have a religious organization, you as the leader, a set of leaders, are going to have to make that thing happen. And in many ways, what that means is that those leaders and that organization has to appeal to human beings to come and to be members of the organization. That's really important. That the people, the members, the attendees, therefore, have a lot of power and influence. And leaders, if they want their organization to stay or stand or work, they're going to have to appeal to that. So that has important implications. And I'll talk about a few of these. One of these implications of the separation of church and state is that what it meant is that there was this institutionalized space in the United States where racially and ethnically oppressed and subordinated groups and immigrants could thrive. Why was that the case? Because the government was not in control. It, interestingly enough, created a space and a culture where people got together on their own. And for immigrants, people who study immigration anyway know or that when people come here from another country, one of their first stops is a religious organization. One of their first stops is the church, right? Because that's where their people, the people who come from their homeland, congregate. It's a safe space to do that. It has also been a safe space for racially and ethnically oppressed groups to get together. Why? Because there you are able to organize. There you are able to cultivate your own culture. There you can build community. There you can purport your own ideas about the world. So it has very important implications. So why do we care about that then? Let's talk about that as it relates to African Americans. What that has meant is that the separation of church and state has provided a context, not indirectly, for what we now call the Black church. The Black church is in many ways a, born out of this space, this institutional space in the United States. Now, what we often think of as the Black church, there's a couple ways to think about it, but some say that it's made up of uh, predominantly Black churches that are a part of Black controlled denominations. Others say it's just made up of people who are Black and attend largely Black churches, different ways to operationalize it. But what we do know is this, is that the Black church was sort of first institutionalized when a person by the name of Richard Allen and other colleagues, including Absalom Jones, back in the 18th century, broke from the Methodist Episcopal Church. Perhaps some of you know about this story. Richard Allen was a minister actually in the Methodist Episcopal Church. That is a largely white controlled denomination. And I had an opportunity actually to visit. This picture here is of Mother Bethel AME. It's the first African Methodist Episcopal Church there in Philadelphia that Richard Allen started. And if you ever have a chance to go, I hope you do. They really have a wonderful museum there in that church as well. But what I was learning from there, in addition, what I've read about Richard Allen, is that Richard Allen was really important for the Methodist Episcopal Church. He would be the main preacher and people would come to hear his sermons, black and white. But then what happened is when they happened to decide to build this balcony in the church, and what they decided, the leaders, white leaders of the church, was that the black people were going to have to sit in the balcony. Well, Richard Allen, here's the preacher bringing people in, as I just said, right? That religion in America is a marketplace, that you need people to come, and Richard Allen is a preacher that's bringing people in. But then black people had to sit in the balcony. And so Richard Allen protested that with Absalom Jones, kneeled down on the main floor of that church, and ultimately were dragged out by white leaders in that church. And he decided, along with others, that right then they were going to build their own community. And it was religious space in the United States that helped to produce that, to develop that. And ultimately, that's what started as a result was the African Methodist Episcopal Church. There are other Black controlled denominations as well, such as the National Baptist Convention and so on. But this here is a historical moment, not only for the Black community in America, but America generally. And so the Black church is a very important institution in the United States, and several scholars have studied it. E. Franklin Frazier, for example, in his book, The Negro Church in America, studied the Black church. And one of the main things that he wanted to talk about there is that the Black church is the most central institution in the Black community, also looking at the diversity of the Black church and the ways in which the Black culture, Black religious culture was practiced. And then C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence H. Mamaya in 1990 rather, had their study, The Black Church and the African American Experience. And there they talk about the Black church being the cultural womb of the Black community. Again, because the Black church is institutionalized and America has that space created for that, that has been a really important space for Black Americans. But before E. Franklin Frazier and Lincoln and Meyer, there was W.E. Du Bois, who did a study of the Negro Church in 1903. In 1903. Now, what's important about this is that W.E. Du Bois really did a phenomenal, rather, even though he says it's not exhaustive, I would say for today's standards, and I know my colleagues, I think, will agree with me, it's almost an exhaustive study of the Negro Church. And I really just want to highlight the methods very quickly. You can see that he's using, this is a picture from the book that I have. He does studies of local communities. He does interviews. He looks at secondary data, but it's not just data for Black Americans, Black churches, Black religious organizations. He's also collecting data on white religious leaders and white churches. Now, what's really important here is that what is Du Bois wanting us to take away from this? One of the main things Du Bois wants us to take away is that the Negro Church demonstrates Blacks' capacity for creating and sustaining structures and organizations within a white supremacist and racially hierarchical society. And in this book, he talks about, in really in depth, such detail, about the structure of the Negro Church, about the resources of the Negro Church, about the wealth of the Negro Church, about the leadership of the Negro Church. But he also talks about the ways in which white religious leaders and white religious organizations interacted with Black Americans, dealt with missionary work when it comes to Black Americans, and the ways in which the white church or white religious leaders thought about Black people's freedom in the US. So now I return back to my point about religion and the emancipation of democracy with that backdrop for you. You see, what Du Bois says in that chapter is this: the religious conscience, especially as it began to look upon America as a place of our freedom and refuge, was torn by the presence of slavery. Du Bois understood keenly that the conscience of America was fundamentally a religious conscience. He understood, even with the souls of Black folk, that, and as my colleague Ed Bloom talks about in his book, W.E. Du Bois, The American Prophet, that that was a book about demonstrating the humanity of Black Americans in a context where religious leaders, white religious leaders, were saying they did not have souls. They were not worthy as other human beings were, in particular whites. So Du Bois understood that. And we can see also that he focuses on a many examples, but I will highlight here in this chapter. He talks about Nat Turner and how Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher who led an insurrection killing 61 white people, he did that because he felt called by God to lead this freedom movement by force. He also talks about the appeal to reason and this book or volume written by David Walker, who was a free black man at the time, who was a free black man. And in this book, Walker evokes God in his treatise to prick white America's conscience as it relates to black people's oppression in America. And so I want to leave you with this as we think about emancipation of democracy, is that religion is central. Du Bois understood that it was central. And even when we get into the 20th century and we think about the civil rights movement, which is fundamentally a religious and Christian movement, understood that as well. And so I hope that we will continue this discussion as we move forward. And I hope that you will continue to think about questions of race, religion, and freedom in the United States. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, I was muted and need to unmute. Next, let us turn to Dr. Hibbs. Dr. Hibbs?
Yes, thank you, Patricia. Really honored to be a part of this panel with great scholars of Du Bois. And I too want to express my gratitude to my colleagues at Baylor for coming up with the idea and then doing a sustained series of webinars about this book and about the thought of Du Bois. My own engagement with Du Bois happens really in two contexts. One in moral philosophy, which I want to talk a little bit about right here at the beginning, and then another in a class that I teach and some writing I do in the philosophy of art, and perhaps I'll have an occasion to talk about that later. But I'm going to back up for a moment just to talk about how this book came to be, at least in part. The Catholic organization, the Knights of Columbus, commissioned three books in the early 1920s. One by Du Bois for the impact of and gift of Black folk in the making of America, and one on the Germans and the making of America and Jews and the making of America. There was a good bit of a backlash after World War I against German Americans, and obviously a history of anti-Semitism as well. And the Knights were interested in promoting a better understanding of the contributions of a diverse set of immigrant groups. Not surprisingly, this coincided 100 years ago is the anniversary of this, we're 100-year anniversary of this book. We're also at the 100th anniversary of a rather famous confrontation in South Bend, Indiana, between Catholic students at the University of Notre Dame and the Klan, who had come to denounce Catholicism. So I want to link this up in a moment to some things Du Bois says in this chapter about immigrants and their perception or lack thereof of the struggle of Black Americans. But it is, I think, instructive that Catholics, particularly in the organization, the Knights of Columbus, were interested in promoting this at a time when Catholics were themselves feeling the pressure of prejudice in America. So Du Bois writes at one point in this chapter that we have as our subject for discussion today, that the immigrants from England, Scotland, and Ireland, who were, he says, in their experience in their native lands, so near to slavery, not actually in slavery, but near to it in some ways, failed to recognize the Black struggle as connected to or similar to their own struggle. They instead were distracted and consumed by economic rivalry. One of the things that strikes me as really interesting about this chapter, and Professor Edwards already mentioned it, the appeal to reason. You might think that in a country founded upon Enlightenment principles, a modern country like the United States, that all it would take or all it should take is an appeal to reason. But Du Bois himself says in the very section where he talks about the appeal to reason, he talks about its limits, the problem of appealing to reason in an unreasoning land, a land where the selfish, breathless battle to earn a living and accumulate wealth seems to block out or marginalize all other concerns. This is, I think, a key theme here of the limits to reason and what blocks reason's access to seeing other groups in their actual condition of affliction and oppression. And I'm interested as a moral philosopher in questions of how virtues and vices, and not just virtues and vices of individuals, but also of communities, and the way in which vice can infect a culture and become systemic and can block our ability to do justice to our neighbors. There is, I think, two features to this that Du Bois brings out here and elsewhere. One is a kind of oblivion, a kind of deliberate and then culturally imposed forgetfulness about history. And one of the importances of this book is to bring to the fore the importance of African American history for Americans. That forgetfulness, which can become habitual and lead us to want to leave history behind, precisely because detailed attention to it is going to force us to face painful truths about our own history and perhaps our current situation. The second thing, over and above oblivion, is a kind of moral blindness. Is moral blindness possible? If so, how does it manifest itself? And what are its root causes? And I think certain kinds of vices can, again, individual and collective, personal and systemic, certain kinds of vices can lead us, can foster a kind of moral blindness in the mainstream moral tradition in the West. Covetousness or greed is defined as a vice that leads us to take pleasure in ourselves as the possessor of riches, leads us to think that we have absolute power and are secure because of our riches. It also can lead us in this tradition to see others as deserving of their poverty or their affliction, because we think that somehow we have, that the wealth that we have is a guarantor of our own superiority. So a whole host of vices are implicit. And Du Bois elsewhere, particularly in The Souls of Black Folk, talks in detail about these vices. And importantly, he talks about them as both personal and individual on the one hand, and also collective and systemic on the other. And I think these are really important lessons that Du Bois touches upon here in this chapter, at least momentarily and implicitly, and that he develops in much richer detail in other works. So thank you for allowing me to make these opening comments.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Hibbs. Let me turn now to Dr. Wright. Dr. Wright, if you would, please.
Well, good afternoon, and I just want to echo my fellow panelists in thanking our Baylor colleagues for hosting this series of webinars and for the intentionality in engaging in this very important Du Boisian moment, because as my fellow panelists have already said, not only is Du Bois an impressive historical figure, but his works remain contemporarily relevant. So in the brief time I have with you today, I want to discuss my research that suggests that Du Bois's theory on leadership has been mischaracterized as only applicable to college-educated persons, and mischaracterized by some as being separate stratum of the human masses. I reframe his theory on leadership and posit that admission into this cadre of leaders is only predicated on one matter, and that's one's affirmative answer to a certain question that I will ask later. Du Bois's Talented 10th is a call, I argue, for social justice warriors and grassroots activists, as understood today, not simply highly credentialed, moneyed, and contented elites who are interested in little more than their current or potential class position. Embedded in my position is the idea that the current Black Lives Matter movement and many of its leaders are the actualization of his Talented 10th vision. In making my argument, I lean heavily on his 1924 masterpiece, The Gift of Black Folk. More specifically, I find justification for my argument in the chapter this panel explores today, The Emancipation of Democracy. One of Du Bois's objectives in his seminal essay on Black leadership is to show from the past that the Talented 10th has arisen among the Negroes have been worthy of leadership. Although Du Bois aggressively promotes a college education as the desired, not exclusive prerequisite for membership into the Talented 10th, he makes allowances for those of, and I quote, exceptional ability to become members of this group, despite not possessing post-secondary credentials and in some cases, no formal education at all. Speaking directly to the Talented 10th status bestowed on non-college educated Black Americans, Du Bois wrote, and I quote from the Souls of Black, from his paper, "Too little notice has been taken of the work which the Talented 10th among Negroes took in the great abolition crusade. There were Purvis and Remond, Pennington and Highland Garrett, Sojourner Truth and Alexander Crummell, and above all, Frederick Douglass. What would the abolition movement have been without them? Where were these Black abolitionists trained? Some, like Frederick Douglass, were self-trained, but trained. Others graduated from famous foreign universities." Now, this passage indicates that Du Bois knowingly admits into his fraternity men and women who lack college training, thus effectively debunking the long-held belief that membership into this group is based singularly on one's higher education credentials. Du Bois ardently believes that the ideal member of the Talented 10th should be educated. However, more important than one's educational background is the inclusion into this group persons who have demonstrated exceptional ability and the willingness to be self-sacrificing and ethical leaders for their race. Support for this notion is gleaned from the first sentence of his classic text that reads, "The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men and women." Again, emphasis on the word exceptional. For many Black Americans, the way one demonstrated their exceptional ability at the dawn of the 20th century, in light of laws severely limiting or restricting the ability of Blacks to obtain education credentials, was through civil and human rights activities in defiance of insidious American apartheid, lynching, and violence. Men and women of exceptional ability like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth separated themselves from the masses through leadership activities directed at abolishing slavery and promoting human rights. This type of self-sacrifice in the face of potential physical and economic demise forms the very core of leadership as envisioned by Du Bois. Conclusively, I argue that one's admission into the Talented 10th is not singularly dependent on the acquisition of a college education, but instead on one's high accomplishments and willingness to engage in self-sacrificing and ethical leadership activities in the cause of human and civil rights. Du Bois was not looking for armchair revolutionaries to lead the masses when he penned his theory on leadership. I believe Du Bois was looking for social justice warriors. And in the chapter Emancipation of Democracy, he clearly makes this case. The book, The Gift of Black Folks, is an accounting of the many ways that Black Americans transformed this nation, often against its will, and always for the better. What he accomplishes in the construction of a new narrative that shows the value of people then considered by many to be less than human. Now, this was accomplished during Jim Crow segregation and at the height of brutality experienced by Black folks at the hands of the first American domestic terrorist organization, the Ku Klux Klan. Du Bois astutely notes in this chapter that, and I quote, "It is usually assumed in reading American history that whatever the Negro has done for America has been passive and unintelligent, that he accompanied the explorers as a beast of burden, and whatever he accomplished he did by sheer accident. Du Bois concludes this paragraph by saying, "This is not true." Most certainly, this is not true, as Du Bois notes the contributions to this country and the world made by members of the talented 10th, like Toussaint Louverture, who he calls the first great Black leader. Too many today do not know the tremendous debt America owes to Toussaint and the Black folk of Haiti. Were it not for their successful fight for freedom, this nation would not now stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So devastating was Haiti's victory over France that Du Bois wrote in this chapter, and I quote, "Toussaint made Napoleon give up his dream of an American empire and sell Louisiana for a song," end quote. Other freedom fighters noted by Du Bois in this chapter were people like Denmark Vesey, who educated scores of Africans and consistently urged them to revolt against slavery. Cinque, who, as a kidnapped African being transported to the United States on a ship called the Amistad, killed his attempted enslavers and eventually won his and the freedom of his boatmates in an American court while being defended by former President John Quincy Adams. And last, Du Bois mentions David Walker in this chapter, whose appeal to the souls of white Americans for fairness and freedom are still being read in classrooms today. While Du Bois does not omit women in his accountings in this chapter, their mentions are fairly brief. However, I believe everyone is familiar with Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, whom he identifies as ethical leaders of the race who engaged in rebellious activities with as much conviction as any of the men mentioned. Most of the people noted in this chapter were not formally educated. Some could not read nor write. Nevertheless, that did not exclude Du Bois from including them in his talented 10th. So long as they were committed to the liberation and ethical leadership of Black people, they were welcome in his fraternity. And the collective impact of these individuals on the nation was and remains simply astonishing. As Du Bois said, and as so for many of our citizens failed to note, one cannot think of democracy in America or in this modern world without reference to the American Negro. Du Bois also noted that the talented 10th spoke, and I quote, spoke not so much as theorists, but as people facing extremely uncomfortable facts. And the question I ask is, how did they address those uncomfortable facts? In part, by conducting social science research that could be used in their defense and aggressively to change their life outcomes and life chances. There was no better way to do this than by establishing a sociological laboratory. When this book was published in 1924, Du Bois's Atlanta Sociological Laboratory had recently ended its more than 2 decades run as the preeminent school of social science in the United States and arguably the world. The famed Chicago School of Sociology at the University of Chicago had not made similar contributions to the sciences, nor had individual scholars made such contributions. However, the relatively small band of scholars, bound together by their magically melanated skin, and who each answered affirmatively to the question, "Am I my brothers and sisters' keeper?" did what Du Bois acknowledged in this book, that earlier generations of his talented 10th did. And what was that? They turned this nation, a theoretical democracy, into an actual democracy. How did they do it? Through social science. Science like that at Atlanta University, where the first studies on religion, family, and urban studies were conducted. Also where methodological practices like Insider Researcher, mixed methods, and the inclusion of methods and limitations sections were institutionalized. And in conclusion, the beauty of Du Bois's book, and this chapter specifically, is that it provides additional evidence of the ways Black folk, particularly the talented 10th, have changed this nation for the better, one generation after another, one death after another, with each successive band of leaders answering affirmatively to the clarion call that, yes, I am my sister's and brother's keeper. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you. I think you have given us a lot to think about, and it encourages lots of questions. So again, to all of the attendees, I encourage you, if you have questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A. let me go ahead and ask a question. I want to ask a question to Dr. Edwards. Dr. Edwards, you talked about the importance of the Black church. And my question is simply this. The Black church certainly was a foundation of the civil rights movement, but arguably it has had diminishing importance in recent years, which is true of many churches, not just the Black churches, as fewer and fewer people are actively engaged in a congregation. So my question for you is there a continuing role for the Black church in promoting democracy?
Wow, that's a great question. And interestingly, I tackled this question in my book Smart Suits, Tattered Boots, that came out a couple years ago. But really, even past COVID, right? We want to think about this even more. And I will say the answer to that question is yes. And the reason why I say the answer to that question is yes is for the reasons that I outlined in my talk, is that religion remains that key institution where Black people can have control. And that's particularly important if you're going to mobilize around issues that are relevant and salient for Black people. It's not to say it can't be done in other ways. It's just saying that institutionally and structurally, that remains an important space. However, what I have argued is that the Black church does have to begin to pivot from being too focused on the frames of the civil rights movement and think about what does it mean to be Black in 21st century America. And that will require a couple things. And my colleague, Dr. Wright, began to kind of hint on that just a little bit when he was talking about women and the role of women in the freedom movement. Is that is something that I would suggest needs to be expanded in the Black church, but also really also bringing in younger leaders and younger people into how the movement that is cultivated in the Black church can grow and expand. So in short, the answer is yes, but I do think there are some modifications about how that has to happen.
Well, thank you. Um, Let me pose a question to Dr. Hibbs. And I'm going to say something that is probably abundantly obvious, but you are a white man. And you're teaching at a university that, despite all the great strides we've made in terms of diversity of our student body and our faculty, whites still comprise the largest racial group. So my question for you, Dr. Hibbs, is what is it like to be teaching mostly white students in this environment?
Yeah, so let me give an example from just last week in this philosophy of art class that I'm teaching, where we've just finished a segment on jazz and Black gospel music. We had Bob Darden from Baylor, who has overseen for years the biggest Black gospel preservation program in the world. And we had him in to give a guest lecture. He came out of retirement for that. But I had them read Du Bois's Sorrow Songs, the last chapter in The Souls of Black Folk, as a way of getting them thinking about the significance of this music, and both jazz and particularly Black gospel. You know, the other thing I did there was to talk about the lynching, the Waco lynching of Jesse Washington. And there's a Du Bois connection to that, right? Because Du Bois, as the new head of a new organization, the NAACP, sent a reporter to cover that and then wrote about it in the crisis. And in fact, put a horrifying image of Jesse Washington's scarred, burned body on the cover of an issue of the crisis. And he wrote of that, any talk of the triumph of Christianity or the spread of human culture is idle twaddle, so long as the Waco lynching, which he labeled the Waco horror, is possible. So I don't know how many of our students know about that. We did finally, just a few years ago, erect a marker at the spot of the lynching in Waco and had a public ceremony. I think it's important for students to know about incidents like that right here in Waco, and also that Du Bois was covering that and writing about it. And having talked about that, I then played for them Billie Holiday's famous song about lynching, Strange Fruit. And we spent moments in that, minutes, just in silence afterward. And then talked about the song, talked about what Du Bois says about the sorrow songs, talked about the horrors of this history that the songs keep alive. So I find that Du Bois, particularly in the art class, this chapter gives students a language for thinking about the importance of art as a way of transforming suffering, but sometimes simply taking us to the heart of the darkness of our history and helping us to dwell there and then think about the repercussions of our neglect of that history and what we might do and how we might think in the present. I think also that Du Bois is such a beautiful and deep writer. I say this not that as if it's a mere ornament, but he gives the students a kind of language for thinking about the most important questions. And among those at the center for Du Bois is this question about the color line. Gives our students a beginning of a vocabulary to think about race and racism that they really don't get from the wider culture all that successfully. So that's how Du Bois functions in my class. I think students are deeply challenged, as they should be, but they also, I hope, now have Du Bois as a writer who's in their memory, speaking to them for the rest of their studies and beyond.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Wright, and I'm also going to go ahead and take the question that is posed in the Q&A because my question and that question are related. Dr. Wright, you talked a lot about the talented 10th, and in some ways, anytime you have a group where there's an in and an out group, in some ways it seems limiting. So my question is, did the concept of the talented 10th help the cause, if you will, or did it in some ways limit it? And the question that we have in the Q&A is, how do we invite non-academic voices into the discussion of democracy? So if you could talk to us a little bit more about the talented 10th and perhaps its limitations or what we could be doing better in terms of the concept.
Sure. I believe the biggest limitation of the concept is the inaccurate definitions or assumptions of what it is. Du Bois never intended for the talented 10th to be this exclusionary, private grouping of uh, uber educated individuals who believe they were elitists and above the lay persons. That has not been what he wanted it to be. He was clear in his 1948 rearticulation of the talented 10th that he was inarticulate in defining what it should be. Essentially, it's similar to, I guess, the Bible verse about there by the grace of God go I, and that we should protect the least of thee. That is what he was arguing for, that the talented tenth should be the person responsible for pushing the society forward. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be, again, educated. What it does mean is that when you are the exceptional person in whatever it is you do, whether that's art, um, diving, poetry, dancing, whatever it is, that exceptional person must take the leadership of the masses. That's not exclusionary. So the biggest challenge that we have as those who are promoting the talented 10th is to debunk this idea that it's this exclusive group of individuals and to let everyone know that they are members of the talented 10th based on one question. Are you willing to engage in ethical and self-sacrificing leadership in the best interest of your brothers and sisters? If you answer affirmatively to that, you are a member.
Thank you. There's another question in the Q&A, and this one is for Dr. Edwards. And the question is, curiosity about Dr. Edwards, do you think religion has been a positive force for progress in American society, especially given strict Sabbatarian laws like the Suppression of Vice and Immorality Act of Virginia from 1786, among other acts?
Thank you so much for that question, Joshua. Yeah, I won't speak specifically to the Sabbatarian laws, but what I will talk about is it a positive force for progress in America? I would say it's both. It can be both and. It can be both positive and it can be negative. And I think the primary point I want to make is that because of how religion is structured in the US, it can be accessed and used in a variety of different ways, which is why it's quite interesting and perplexing about the way that religion manifest in America, particularly when it comes to issues of inequality. On the one hand, you can have the Black church and other communities of color really draw upon religion as a source of liberation and a call for freedom and the basis for a social movement. And then you can also have people draw upon religion, such as hate groups and terrorist groups, as in the United States, to say that this is how things should be. And so it can be a both and. It's not a simple answer. And I think that one of the things that we want to continue to think about is what is religion doing and why is it manifesting in the ways that it does? And then how is it that different groups are going about accessing that, not only in Du Bois' time, but even today?
I have a question that I'd like to pose to the panel as a whole. There was one passage that struck me in particular where Dr. Du Bois makes the point in the chapter that we're discussing that the motive force of democracy has nearly always been a push from below. He specifically says the determination of poor whites in the South not to be outdone by the Negro has been caused by the Black man's frantic efforts to rise rather than by any innate ambition on the part of the lower class of whites. That passage struck me, but my question for you all is your reaction to this passage and how it pertains to democracy in the 21st century, particularly our current political climate, where, if anything, it seems like the divisiveness between the races has pushed or pulled democracy backwards. So, your thoughts? I'll let anybody who wants to answer that go first, if you would.
Well, I'll just continue my previous answer because it kind of relates to it in terms of the bottom-up nature of alliances, allyship, and that is at the core of what Du Bois, again, protests was arguing for, that leaders should come from the people, but they must be, again, ethical and self-sacrificing. Too often what we have are leaders who are not necessarily ethical and don't necessarily want to sacrifice. And if you have that equation in play, then I think it's more difficult for groups, even similarly situated at the bottom of the wheel, so to speak, to come together, especially when there are other forces that can benefit financially through capitalism by having groups separated and at each other's necks.
Does anyone else want to weigh in? We have other questions, so I don't want to limit you or belabor the point.
Well, I will say that though, and perhaps this is a bit of what you're getting to, um, Dr. Wilson, is that there is a benefit to being white. And I think that's what Du Bois is talking about, even when talks about the psychological wage of whiteness. That even I may be poor, and I may not have two dimes to rub together, but at least I'm white. And so there's that framing and the benefits that come with that that can work to divide people and really take people's eyes off of a system and a structure that ultimately benefits what Du Bois talks about in this chapter, which is the divine right to not have wealth because of your birth, but because you're a merchant or because you're a business person, right? And so in some ways, I think that ultimately, yes, it has to come. It helps to come from the bottom. But I also think that once we really begin to see how race works in the United States and what it is doing to divide and create hierarchy, then we won't be able to really have those cross-racial or intergroup movements.
Let me take a question from the Q&A. Specifically, this is for Dr. Wright. I was interested by your comment about how there can be sincere efforts towards social justice, but also how there can be self-serving efforts towards social justice, whereby the advocate is most concerned with their own social status. What heuristics could one use to discern those motivations?
Well, that's apparently a misstatement for a wrong choice, I guess, because there's no way you can be self-serving And Du Bois was making the argument that I horribly messed up with stating that you must be selfless and self-sacrificing to be a leader. Without that, then no effort will be successful, as understood with the talented 10th.
All right. We're running out of time. Let me ask one last question. And that is, arguably late in life, Dr. Du Bois seems to have given up on democracy. The Washington Post obituary after his death describes him as being pessimistic about the prospects of American democracy. Was that wisdom on the part of assuming that the Washington Post was right, was that wisdom on his part, or was he simply being a realist, or is there some other way to interpret his pessimism?
Well, we can look at it through the lens of someone who lived to be 95 years of age. He was born 3 years after the Civil War, 1868, and he died the day before / morning of the 1963 March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the I Have a Dream speech. So you can imagine the changes that take place in one's thinking over nearly 100 years. He began as a really conservative thinker in many respects, Du Bois. He believed that simply if we became more educated, then the world will realize that there are very few differences between the races. So I would argue that he, over time, almost 1 century, seeing how unmovable in many respects the United States wasn't necessarily a pessimist, but a realist. And he took account of a century's worth of lived data to come to the conclusion that he would find democracy best in Ghana, where he died.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I believe that that is what happens when you live a long life and you're reflective about your life and your environment. I would not frame it as pessimistic. I think that has something to do with the source that's writing it, and rather see it as a person who is, as we already talked about, accumulated a good deal of wisdom. And that's because of seeing change, but not seeing the kind of change that one might anticipate. It is interesting that Martin Luther King was using some of the same frames that were he's talking about in the Emancipation of Democracy, the same frames that were used by Frederick Douglass, right? Appealing to the Declaration of Independence. And here we are 150 years later at that time, or saying the same thing. And so, of course, he could say that. And I would say this. We know of the sad, devastating death and killing of George Floyd, who died at the hands of police officers. And that was captured and put on social media. And then we know what happened as a result. We saw a massive movement. It sparked or gave fuel to the Black Lives Matter movement. But I want to highlight that just this year in my state of Ohio, Canton, Ohio, a man by the name of Frank Tyson was murdered in the same way. Knee to the back, said he couldn't breathe, and was killed by police officers. So one might say, is one somebody being pessimistic when they say that's still going on? Or are they being a realist? And so I think that we just have to, and since this is a Christian space, I think if we're going to really repent, then there must be an account of what needs to be changed. And until that occurs, and we will continue to reproduce the same outcomes that we have in the past.
We are at the end of our time, but I do just want to know one additional question. And maybe just leave it for all that are listening in to ponder for themselves. Alas, should we then persist? I can't help but think the answer is yes, but if we could quickly go around the panel, we will end with that question. Corey.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, while on the one hand, we say that we're still seeing many of the same outcomes, at the same time, we can say we are seeing change. And so we must persist, but we must persist for freedom. And we must persist because if in a space like this, we are actually called to pursue true freedom. And so the answer is yes for me.
Dr. Hibbs?
Yeah, I think of James Baldwin's comment that Americans are not good at tragedy. We want to think that we can get rid of the bad things, and then if we don't get rid of them, we tend to suppress or forget them. I think tragedy and hope is the kind of wisdom that Du Bois had at the end of his life, that Martin Luther King had at the end of his life, who became more and more skeptical about the change that he was not seeing. And so I think that dwelling in that space of the tragic gap between what we hope and long for and what we've achieved, and some kind of hope that we can still make progress, especially as Christians, is the space we need to occupy.
And last, with only a very quick answer, Dr. Wright.
I agree with my colleagues. We must persist for the legacy of our ancestors who faced much harder conditions than we did, for ourselves to make our current condition better, and most importantly, for our future generations to make sure their world is much better than we find ours.
Thank you. Thank you to our panel, and thank you for all who joined in and listened in and posed your excellent questions. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you very much. I believe that there's going to be some information for those who were listening in for credit.